Hello there. Today we are about to get nasty. I mean, you read the title. It's about the disaster at the latrine. So if you're not that type that can stomach this kind of topic, poor choice of words, don't worry, we are not going to get too graphic. I would still advise to keep the hands off the snacks and try not to imagine things too vividly as we dive right into very poor choice of words as we examine a tragic and yet somehow darkly hilarious event of hygiene history. So let's travel to the 12th century Germany. It all began with a dispute between Archbishop Conrad of Mainz and Landgrave Ludwig III of Thuringia. You see, in the Holy Roman Empire, both nobles and church officials could hold lands, and thus such disputes were often about. Since Ludwig had sided with the imperial family of the Hohenstaufens in one of their conflicts against the Wals, which in itself is such a major topic that will deserve its own episode, King Henry VI of Hohenstaufen was sent by his father, the emperor, to intervene personally and finally solve this conflict. Of course, Henry couldn't just side with Ludwig, as the Archbishop of Mainz was one of the most powerful lords in the empire and had been a close personal ally of his father, the famous Frederick Barbarossa. The decision was made that a personal meeting at the Hoftag was in order. Before we talk about what a Hoftag is and what happened there, let's briefly talk about hygiene in the Middle Ages. Most people certainly have the imagination that everyone in medieval Europe was dirty, encrusted in mud and even worse kinds of grime. That, however, is not quite true. Bathing and personal hygiene were very important in the Middle Ages. People were expected to wash themselves on a regular basis in wash troughs, usually in cold water, which can't have been very pleasant. Bathhouses were, however, also an institution, often either run by men and women from their backyards of their houses or by monks in monasteries. Traveling barbers also offered this as a service, along with medical care. And of course, soap making was a booming business throughout the entirety of the medieval period as well. For defecation, latrines were used. This practice was spread by the Romans, who clustered public latrines all over their empire, hence the word's Latin roots. In fact, the word lavatory also stems back from the same word as latrine, the Roman word for bath, lavatrina. The basic principle of a latrine is that you dig a pit and put some benches with cut-out holes over it. Fairly simple concept, but with the major problem that the pit fills up eventually. So people had to dig up the waste regularly. This was an important job for sanitation, but none anyone really wanted to do. Hence, such latrine workers were usually seen as outcasts in medieval society, as they were doing dirty work, similar to executioners or undertakers. This type of work was also sometimes used as a punishment, for example in place of a prison sentence or alongside it. In places where people were a bit smarter in constructing these latrines, they dug out a trench instead of a pit. This way, the waste would slowly drain on its own, though it still had to be removed from the end of the trench manually. Some latrines also used water tanks to reduce the odors. In palaces, castles, and other places used by the rich and powerful, the latrines could be suspended, meaning the excrements would fall up to several meters before landing in a cesspool. I wonder if people were not allowed to use those in stormy weather. Okay, back to the unfortunate event. I think we wanted to clear up what a Hoftag is. Essentially, it is a meeting convened by at least a prince of the empire, but often the king of the Romans himself, which, by the way, was the official title of the German kings at the time. Unlike Reichstage or imperial diets in English, which were used for matters of state, the Hoftage existed mostly to settle disputes between nobles and similar smaller-scale issues. Now, the high society of the Holy Roman Empire met up in Erfurt, an important city held by Landgrave Ludwig. Henry VI was actually on a military campaign in Poland, but the matter was seen as so pressing that Emperor Barbarossa ordered his son to attend. Many more dignitaries, mediators, and spectating nobles arrived with him. On the 25th of July 1184, the Hoftag gathered in a building close to the Erfurt Cathedral. Which building exactly is not certain. We only know it was a two-storied building, so the bishop's residence or the provost's office are likely. The meeting continued into the next day, the 26th of July, which is when the unthinkable happened. Too many attendees attempted to use the latrines at the same time. Too many for the old and rotten wooden beams. Almost the entire second floor collapsed. dropping the latrine and anyone inside it into the cesspit below. 60 people perished that day. The lucky ones died from the impact of the fall or from being crushed by debris. The less fortunate souls drowned in the waste below or suffocated from fumes while being trapped under rubble. Among the victims were several counts and many minor nobles. Henry VI and Archbishop Conrad survived by not being in the latrine when it collapsed. They held onto a window alcove of stone until they could be rescued by ladders. Landgrave Ludwig actually fell into the cesspit but survived. The most prominent victim of the disaster was Count Henry of Schwarzenburg, who supposedly had the habit of saying, "If I did that, I'd have to drown in the privy." It feels almost too convenient to be true, but on the other hand, life writes stranger plots all the time. The saying, combined with his demise, certainly made him famous. The young king certainly had enough of the negotiations after this tragedy and left to resume his campaign in Poland. Conrad and Ludwig were left behind bickering, trying to figure out if this disaster was a divine sign as to who was in the right. The whole story inspired several retellings in prose and became one of the most iconic stories associated with the city of Erfurt to this day. And I have to admit, there is just something darkly funny about the top of the societal hierarchy drowning in the lowest bit that people didn't even like to talk about. This concludes today's episode. I hope you had fun with this episode. We certainly tried to stick the landing. What is it today with me and my phrasing? Anyway, thanks again to my wonderful artist and to you viewers. Consider leaving a like, a comment and subscribe if you haven't done so yet. Until next time, bye! Many more dignitaries, mediators and spectating nobles arrived with him. On the 25th of July, 1184, the Hoftag gathered in a building close to the Erfurt Cathedral. Ah, man. Almost got through that in one try.